Really excited to have Gregg Bernstein joining us. Gregg is the director of user research for Hearst Magazines, where he connects the world of content creation and consumption. He's previously managed innovation research practices at Condé Nast, Vox Media, MailChimp, and has taught design, branding, and typography at Georgia State University. He's also studied journalism at the University of Georgia and earned his MFA in graphic design from the Savannah College of Art and Design, where he focused on user experience research and design. And Gregg, much like me, has a musical past, but maybe on a slightly different side of things. He created album covers for punk and emo bands and has designed for clients in the music and advertising industries as well. So definitely a love of both software as well as the stuff that really matters, the culture and the art, which is great to see. So with that, we're going to get started with Gregg and this discussion on everything related to Gregg's wonderful book. And one quick announcement as well, as we will be giving away 8 copies of Gregg's book. We'd love to make one of those available to some of the people here attending and participating, and hope you get a chance to read it and enjoy some of the wonderful, valuable content that is part of that. So Gregg, welcome. Really great you could be here. This book is a really great book. I really enjoyed it. And it's the book I wish that I had when I first started getting work in user research prior to moving in product. It covers a lot of really great content, from finding your way into that role, starting that first job and opportunity, to growing your practice, overcoming all the hurdles and challenges that we all deal with, to really establishing and really building a foundation of a great research culture and practice. I'm curious what prompted you to lean in and collect all these inputs from so many different practitioners and put that book together and write it.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me here, Scott, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. But to answer your question, this book began as a conference talk. Earlier in my career, as you mentioned, I worked at MailChimp and at Vox Media. And in both organizations, I ended up scaling up the research practices. And that meant taking on more responsibilities and hiring teams and working across different business functions. And I'd written blog posts and newsletters about this journey I was on, and I'd spoken at conferences about everything I was learning. And one of my talks was about how I'd taken very practical approaches to scaling up research in my organizations. And what happened was people would come up to me after I'd given this talk, or they'd email me later or connect with me on LinkedIn, and they'd ask me follow-up questions about how exactly I was getting things done and how I would handle different scenarios. And people were seeking advice. And I realized that there were researchers that were hungry for a field guide on what does the career journey look like as a UX researcher? What are the things that we'll have to navigate as we move forward in this field of user research? I guess maybe like a moron, I decided that I should try to write this book. But I soon realized that my perspective wasn't enough. I worked at 2 companies, but what I was going through was not similar to what somebody was going through at a place like Google or working in fintech or in healthcare. So I open sourced the book. I invited other research leaders to contribute their perspectives. I hired a wonderful editor named Nicole Fenton to help me make sense of all of this content. And then it became this gigantic tome that we were giving away 8 copies of later today. So that's the very short version of how this book came about.
One of the pieces that really stood out for me was the variety of perspectives in the book. And I think the tack and approach you took on that, I think, was a great decision to include lots of other voices, as well as your own summaries of all of that stuff essentially in there as well, and your own thoughts. You have a really good piece in the introduction where you say the mission of making everyone smarter supersedes any methodology or organizational silo. Information that helps a designer also helps the sales team, and reports that the support teams collect are also useful to product managers. And researchers connect essentially those teams and the dots between them. So I'm curious why we still, as product teams, struggle to effectively democratize this way of thinking, and maybe ways in which you think we could maybe do better here.
Yeah, it is a challenge to connect the dots. I think the short answer is that habits are hard to break, especially as an organization evolves and organizations become more fragmented and people become more specialized. So just thinking about data that helps us make better decisions. You might have a market research team and a user research team and a data science team and an analytics team. And in an ideal world, everybody knows that those teams exist, and those teams are putting their information where everybody will find it, and everybody knows how to request more details or suggest areas to explore further. That's not the reality, though. Usually these teams are separated by reporting lines, and they have enough demands on their time that thinking holistically about the entire organization ends up taking a back seat. You presented the question as democratizing, but I think another way to think about it is operationalizing research. So what infrastructure and processes can we put in place to give everyone what they need to make product decisions? I think that's the real challenge that we're up against here.
And is that maybe a fundamental challenge of like how we all take our own perspectives to that problem? Or is it a challenge of like communication? Is it like, is there some part of that, or maybe the both of those that I just even mentioned, but like what might be that sort of underpinning part that between maybe a team that does that well and a team that doesn't do it well in terms of establishing that practice?
I think it is communication more than anything. I think it doesn't take a lot of effort to send out a company-wide newsletter. I mean, it sounds easier said than done, but there shouldn't be blockers to you sharing information you're learning and saying, this might be helpful to everyone else. Way back when I was at MailChimp, it was taking what we were hearing in user interviews and sharing it with the marketing team. And then the marketing team would share that with the accounting team. And then the accounting team would come to us and say, oh, we have some questions around, how people were trying to pay their bills and whatnot. So just that effort of communicating, it was a virtuous cycle, and it ended up making all of us aware of what we were all doing and how we could better collaborate. I think communication is probably the key there.
That's really great. Great example too. I guess your newsletter probably went out on MailChimp, right?
Yes. Good guess.
Thinking about things from a research perspective, what should researchers be mindful of when first joining or stepping into a product organization?
I guess for researchers, as with any new hire, there's always pressure to perform when you start a new role. After all, you were hired for a reason. There was a need that your job was open to fulfill. But my advice to new joiners is to give yourself time to understand how projects become projects in your new organization. So understand, going back to that theme, how do people communicate? What information do people leverage when they're making decisions? Where do you as a researcher fit in now, but also what opportunities are there for you to evolve how your new team works? This could be taking on a low profile, tightly scoped project just to see what it's like to even conduct research in your new role. How do you recruit users? How do you conduct research? How do you share findings? That's not just going to serve your organization, but it serves you as a new researcher in a new role to just understand what are the tools at my disposal? How do people want to collaborate with me? How can I share my information? For product organizations, I think my biggest piece of advice is to allocate time for researchers to do research. I often see sprints planned with little to no time for research, which is a very bad misalignment. So if you're an organization and you've brought in a researcher, involve your researchers in sprint planning or road mapping. Designate times when discovery research is crucial, and also times when usability testing will be mission critical. Researchers are there to help you make informed decisions, and we're good at shape-shifting and figuring out how to fit your needs, but it does require some forethought. Just be mindful, if you have a researcher in your organization, put them to work. No researcher will say no to being leveraged and being asked to be a part of the process.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think teams are just so much better when they've got that kind of like research side as part of not only their culture, but the forward thinking part of putting an understanding or an exploration of the why and the problems and the needs and all that front and forward. For those that haven't worked with researchers before, where should they start? And what value do researchers add to product teams and companies that want to build better products or services?
In my experience, researchers are usually hired out of need or desperation. Researchers are usually the last to join a product team that already has product people, designers, and engineers. The situations that lead to research are pretty common. Maybe there's too much going on for everyone to do research, in addition to their other responsibilities of managing, designing, and coding products. Maybe there's an acknowledgement that the research everyone is doing has topped out, and it's time to mature the research efforts and bring in some new methodologies or new ways of thinking about doing research. So that's usually when you bring in a researcher. The thing to know is that researchers do their best when they have situational awareness. Like I was saying before, like when we're brought in for sprint planning or quarterly planning and we know what's coming up or what the big company missions are. So the more context we as researchers have, the better for everyone. So if you are working with a researcher for the first time, know that you will never hear the words, "This is too much information." Like we need all the information, and then we can start to prioritize it and make sense of it. The second part of your question, though, was around the value researchers add. I think the best way to answer this is, what if I told you that you could have someone who lives and breathes users or customers or members or whatever you call the people who build your product or the people you build your product for? What if there was somebody who wants nothing more than to know why users do the things they do or pay for the things they pay for? That's the value that user researchers bring to any organization. Our job is to learn from users, spot differences or similarities in different types of users, understand where our products fit into the ecosystems of our customers' businesses or their lives, and help everyone make smarter decisions based on this firsthand knowledge. So we're like the reconnaissance team that is going out and telling you, like, here's what you need to know about this big thing that we're about to do. It's like a cheat code. You get to know your users firsthand.
There's been a lot of, I don't know if maybe chatter is the right word, but a lot of maybe people talking about this shift, jumping from user research into product. And curious on your kind of perspectives here, if this is a trend reflecting like a broader issue or really an opportunity to be simply closer to the customer and the needs of the customer and our ability to get there and deliver more value for them in a more effective way.
Yeah, this is a very timely question. And it's funny, I just got back from a research leadership summit in Toronto where this was a question that was top of mind. As much as I wish it was simply the opportunity to be closer to delivering value to our customers, the reality is that the career ladder for researchers often tops out at the director level or less frequently the VP level. So if you're a senior or a principal, you can see that there might not be much more opportunity for growth for you as a user researcher. Product, on the other hand, is an area that's growing and can lead to a product director role, group product director, CPO. Personally, I'd prefer we see more SVPs of research or even chief research officers. But until that day comes, the swing to product roles might be sensible just from a sense of having a career and seeing continued career growth. I wish it wasn't that way. I wish there were more opportunities, but I think that's a pretty practical choice to make to go into product.
Yeah. Have you seen anything reflected maybe from that conversation you had in Toronto or otherwise where it might be more also tied to the macroeconomic environment in the sense of how teams have been readjusting or resizing around how they're going to tackle and gain those insights from their customers?
We didn't tackle it in that way, but it was interesting to us that researchers were often the roles that were being cut in this environment. And I could be wrong, but it didn't seem like there were so many product roles that were being cut lately.
Yeah, it feels short-sighted in some ways.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a part in the book where you have Matt Arnold talk about the importance of curiosity, being able to play well with others, get shit done, as he calls it, be productive while also knowing the right tools essentially to apply. And in that same chapter, you have a part where you say that essentially collaboration and flexibility here are really important themes. Over your career and looking back, where have these traits emerged for you and how can teams really foster those key skills and deliver better product?
First of all, shout out to Matt Arnold, a contributor to the research practice book. I'll hold it up once again. But yeah, flexibility and collaboration, those are definitely key traits, not just for researchers, but anyone on a product team. And here's why I say that. The best laid plans go awry. Things will break. We will get unexpected feedback. Customers will react poorly to a change. So we have to be very practical to work in this context. And so when something unexpected happens, and it will happen, how will you and your team course correct? For a product team, it might mean huddling, coming up with a quick plan and executing. And for a researcher, it might mean pausing one research project to rapidly gather feedback from complaining customers or doing a quick analysis of support tickets to suss out why customers are upset. But I think teams can foster these skills by acknowledging reality when they're planning their work. One way I've seen this happen is through a pre-mortem where everyone on a project game plans the worst case scenarios before they start the project. So a scenario might be we launch something and it breaks Sunday, or we don't explain the feature well and people struggle to use it, or even worse, they don't use it at all, or customers try it and just hate it. So an exercise like a pre-mortem is a good way to start building in flexibility and collaboration from the beginning, because in that exercise, you are trying to hedge against failure while also acknowledging that things might go wrong. And I think by default, that makes you more collaborative and more flexible because you're acknowledging the perfect scenario might not happen, and we are going to have to iterate on the fly when things do inevitably go wrong.
Yeah, I think good software in the end is iterable and reactive essentially to new learning. So can't see why that would be a bad thing to do. You noted in one of your blog posts that you were hired into your last two roles because designers and product managers had more questions than time to answer them. And the products became complex, the number of users grew, and the risk essentially of making wrong decisions increased. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how your role and how researchers in general can provide perspectives to product teams and help minimize some of those risks and help those teams make essentially better bets.
Yeah, I worked for our chief data scientist for a while when I was at MailChimp, and he's moved on to become a chief product officer. And we were catching up about a year and a half ago, and I said, we worked together long ago. We've both gone in different paths in our career. In your opinion, how would you describe the ideal place for research within a product organization? And I know he wasn't the first to say this, but he was really keen on describing it as research has to work at different elevations. And ideally, the researcher is able to shift their elevation, but they always have to be aware of multiple elevations. So we're embedding on specific projects and we're working in specific product groups, but we also need to see the larger commonalities, pain points, and opportunities across everything the entire organization is working on, which is also very valuable. And so we could see how we might operationalize research when we have all these different elevations to give product teams a baseline understanding of not just the users that we're currently designing for, but all of our users. So we could say, this is why people generally sign up for our product. This is how they feel about the experience of using our product. This is what they wish that we would change about our product. And this is why people are churning from our product and where they're going instead and now spending money. That's bread and butter. That's what we need to know. And you only get that when you are looking at research from a high elevation across everything. So the micro projects and the macro trends give us a starting point. We get insights at multiple elevations that help us identify the gaps in our knowledge. We can then fill with supplemental research to minimize risk and, as you put it, make better bets, because we already have the fundamentals. We know what our gaps are. That's what we can dive into with specific research and really make sure that we are building things for the right people at the right time. So to be sure, this isn't a just add water situation. Like the research I'm describing is an investment. It takes time and it will pay off. It'll just take some course correcting and adjustments along the way. But once you bring research in and make it a valuable part of the team and continue to invest in it, that's the payoff. You have big picture awareness and you also are able to see those gaps, dive in and address them.
I love that lens on the macro and the micro, because I think sometimes user research in some organizations is one or the other, not both. Yep. And the value that both perspectives bring on that as elevation is really great. We've got an interesting macroeconomic environment, obviously, right now. And we mentioned earlier that teams have downsized or right-sized or shifted to maybe contract roles or made other kinds of changes essentially to try to work around that. What patterns maybe are you seeing around teams, and how are they essentially working with less and effectively continuing to both understand those market problems, but also capture market share, accelerate their innovation, stay ahead of the competition and that kind of thing in this changing landscape?
Yes, very depressing question, but I mentioned that researchers are often the last hired to product design and engineering teams, and the recent layoffs seem to point to a lot of researchers being the first asked to leave an organization. So I've seen researchers in this new environment, I guess, reallocated to higher priority projects or tasked with widening the scope of their responsibilities. So whereas a researcher might have originally worked with one product group or trio or however you want to describe it, they're now working across multiple groups. Just because you might have fewer researchers, it doesn't mean research stops. Product trios, and when I say product trios, I'm using the Teresa Torres version of designer, engineer, PM. They should still continue to speak to customers. Research should still inform the design process. And good research still requires expertise. I would encourage teams to leverage what researchers still remain in their organizations as consultants. At the same time, I'd encourage researchers to extend the scope of their work, maybe by holding office hours open to anyone, running workshops, and continuing to hammer the message that research de-risks products and helps us make better bets. I guess it's a combination of researchers are taking on more work, and also in this new environment, we have to be willing to put ourselves out there and become coaches, become consultants. I don't want people to work more than their 40 hours per week, but is there a way to extend the reach of your expertise within those 40 hours so that your company is still making smart decisions?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, as mentioned, I think it is weird times, right? It seems like the wrong place to make a cut decision in so many ways. Like understanding everything about what your customer needs is such a critical path, and here we are cutting the role that helps us understand that in the larger space and landscape. I want to jump to a question on customer centricity. Customer centricity is so critically important as organizations look to innovate and avoid product failure. And to be successful, we have to learn from our customers. We have to effectively create strategies and the products that solve for those needs and pains. And we have to engage our customers themselves in our actual products and the activities. Are there some examples or stories that you can share of where those kind of elements came to life in the product and or research teams that you were part of?
Unfortunately, when it is working, when you feel it, that's rare. And I was spoiled when I was at MailChimp because that was the first role I had after I transitioned from being a designer to design professor to working in UX research. So that was my first role, and I thought, oh, this is magic. This is how things work. And it turned out that wasn't the case. But when I was there, my research team was part of our larger data science group. So in the data, we could spot trends in signups. We could see who was paying us the most money month over month. And we could also see why people were closing their accounts, how much those accounts were spending per month. And we could see problem areas rising. And so we started seeing like some of our most expensive accounts are starting to close their accounts more often. And so we could conduct qualitative research to learn more about those trends we were spotting. And then after we did the qualitative research, we could work with our designers and engineers to build new products based on what we were hearing. And then we could share what we had built with our users and show that we were invested in their success and we were engaged and we wanted to make products that fit their scenarios. So to me, that felt magical. We had this good combination. We had data, we had qualitative research and design and engineering and marketing all working in lockstep to build the right products that mitigated churn and also increased revenue. It wasn't always like that in every role I've had, but that to me felt very customer centric. Later, when I was at Vox Media, I started on a team that was a small team that was building a CMS or content management system for our editorial teams. So at Vox Media, that's Vox.com and Eater, The Verge, Polygon, to name a few. All of those teams work on the same piece of software for creating their content and publishing their stories. I was brought in to lead research as we built out that new CMS. My job was to understand how writers write and how editors edit, and it's a very complicated area. But in that role, I was really fortunate to partner with a community manager whose job was to listen to feedback, create documentation and educational materials, present new products when we launched them. And so between the two of us, we were learning how teams created content, identifying pain points and opportunities, testing new ideas, launching those new ideas, as I said, creating documentation around those new launches, and then gathering feedback after we launched. And that was pretty magical because just through the research and the community engagement, we were building trust and credibility with our users, who were all the writers and editors who needed the CMS to do their job and write stories. So because we were in constant communication with those folks, they knew we were taking their scenarios to heart, and they knew we were building a product that would help them do their jobs better. And as a product team, we knew we were always building, maybe not the perfect thing, but we were building the right thing and building it pretty close to the right way. As you said earlier, we were still iterating as we heard feedback, but it was a really good virtuous cycle where we were listening, we were reacting, and building credibility and trust, and being very customer centric. Customers, in this case, being internal users who create all our content.
I love that. I think it's wonderful to see when a team can hum along really efficiently and really and truly understand and get a sense of not only the market need and the problem, but also the customer comes along on that journey in a partnership.
I was just going to say, those are the platonic ideal of customer centricity in my experience, but as I said, that's not always the case. And so I've also made it my mission when I've worked in other organizations. Now that I know that is the North Star I think we should be striving for, then there's the job I was hired for, but then there's also the job of, okay, how can we create a customer-centric culture as we are also trying to achieve our OKRs and launch products and increase revenue, whatever the mission is. Once you had a taste of that magical state, you keep going for it again and again.
You open the book with a story that maybe is a little more personal about your wife's cancer diagnosis and the doctor uncovering her story to shape a treatment plan. And you note that everything is important and every data point tells a story. And to make bets, essentially, we need to understand why. So what's one tip maybe you'd share to surface those stories or to uncover those stories? I'm thinking probably the questioning technique that this doctor used is a great example of that. But essentially, how do we unpack those stories? Because stories is such a valuable and powerful tool for product teams, both from a sharing of understanding, but also in communicating to others what we've learned and what we've understood.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I won't tell the whole story. You'll have to read it in the book. But in 2013, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. And we worked with a doctor at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. That doctor spent hours with us, asking us questions to learn not just about her medical condition, but about our lives. And based on the many details we shared, most of which we didn't even realize he was ingesting and synthesizing, he and his medical team put a comprehensive and holistic treatment plan in place. And it was the right approach because we're now 10 years out from that diagnosis. And my wife, I'm happy to say, is cancer-free. But what I learned from that experience, and it was probably the biggest impact on my life, was just the power of asking good questions. And maybe it goes back to being customer-centric and trying to put the customer at the center of everything we do. But reflecting back, as people working in product orgs, we tend to narrowly focus on the very specific scenarios we're trying to solve. But we're doing so at the cost of understanding the larger story. So stories have beginnings, middles, and ends, or I guess more traditionally, there's the 3-act structure of the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. But I guess my tip, if I had to provide one tip based on that experience that we went through with my wife and the doctor, was start at Act 1, not Act 3. Create the space for your customers or your users to tell their stories and give you details, because you might be working on something that feels very narrowly scoped. But if you know how somebody arrived at the scenario in which they're using that feature you're building, or the decisions they're wrestling with as they decide whether to sign up for your product or not, it's going to make you better understand their scenarios. It's going to help you make better bets because you have more contextual information. And so that's my one tip that came out of that, and something I took to heart. Don't just focus on the thing that you're supposed to be focusing on. There's a lot that led up to that point, and we need to know this information. But as a product organization, you have to know not just about your product and your competitors, but the entire ecosystem in which you are working. So that means getting to know your users and making the space to listen to their stories.
Thanks for sharing that story. I know it's a little
Yeah.
personal, but it's also a wonderful example of how to open up and do that kind of listening. One last final question before we jump to Q&A. Any last words of wisdom, things that you want to share maybe with our attendees today that you want to have them walk away from and think about before we leave?
I'm biased here, but to me, researchers are skilled in knowing the right methods to use with the right people at the right time. I think having researchers within an organization is an accelerant to better decisions. But not every organization has researchers or has the budget or capabilities, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing research activities. Just have conversations with your users, whatever your role is, PM, engineer, designer. Get in touch with your users. Ask them about the last time they used your product. Ask them about the last time they used one of your competitors' products. Ask them to show you how they achieve a goal or complete a task. And then when you have budgets or you have questions that you are having trouble answering, then open a role for a researcher, because you won't regret it. Nobody ever hires a researcher and says, that was a mistake, this is too much information. And then maybe buy my book and give it to your new researchers so they know what they're getting into and what their career might look like. But yeah, just be curious. You might not be a researcher, but you should still be doing research, and that's how you make better bets and make better product decisions.
Thanks so much, Greg. Really appreciate this set of insights. Yeah. And really encourage people to check Greg's book out. It's, I don't know if it's on my camera the right place, but really fantastic. And definitely a resource I wish I had when I started my early career in research. I want to jump over to some questions, though. We've got a lot of great people here. We've got about 20 minutes left. Nicholas, a question here. Is there a risk that secondhand interview interpretation leads those other non-UXR functions to the wrong conclusions if done without the proper context or guidance?
Yeah, it sounds like the question is the distillation of research possibly biased? Is the person who is sharing the insights maybe not capturing everything accurately? That is always a risk. And so one thing I try to do, and what I ask my teams to do, share your takeaways, create synopses, put bullet points in Slack. But there's no substitute for creating a highlight reel where the actual user is explaining a scenario or giving feedback. This way, the people who are consuming research know that it's coming straight from the source, and maybe they do come up with a different interpretation or a different takeaway, but at least this way you're sharing the reason that you came up with your synthesis or your interpretation of what the user is saying. You're providing your takeaway plus the evidence. So I guess the real lesson there is share your sources along with your reasons for how you interpreted the data.
The next question here from Saurabh, and I think it's probably the question of the day. What kind of effect is AI or ML having on user research in product organizations?
I love this question. I don't think I've had a day go by in the last 2 months where this wasn't something on my mind or the mind of my product team. First of all, I'll say, if you're thinking about just asking a LLM or an AI research questions in lieu of talking to users, don't do that. There's no substitute for talking to users. However, I have seen some really interesting work where researchers and product folks are still doing the work of creating hypotheses, creating discussion guides, talking to real, actual human beings. But then they'll analyze their notes or they'll read through the transcripts and come up with their takeaways, but they will also upload the transcripts to an AI and they'll query it and say, this is a conversation about why people subscribe to magazines. Based on these 10 interviews, what are the top jobs to be done that you think these users are trying to do? Or maybe it's a way to gut check your work. I've analyzed these interviews, I've created my takeaways. Let me see how this AI also analyzes it. And then you can compare and contrast. Oh, that's interesting. It came up with a completely different takeaway, or it came up with the exact same takeaways. So I'm on the right track. I feel good or confident about using AI in my research, or I feel good about the results that I've come to, and the AI checked my work and I feel confident in what I'm sharing. So I do think it can be helpful, it can be additive, but you still need to ask good questions and you still need human beings, actual human beings on the other end of it. So I don't want to say I am fully on board with AI, but I still see the practicality. I see where we're going. And I think it can be a really useful tool in our toolbox to help us, especially in synthesis and spot checking or checking over our work before we share it out with others. That's where I've landed.
No, that's good.
You're cautiously optimistic.
I think everybody is in this space right now, nervous and optimistic at the same time. So yeah, it's interesting. A question here from D. Maybe it's not a common practice with internal teams to do full-fledged research. It's not a priority as they're always busy with other work. This person is a product owner, prioritize or at least start doing something like this. I think maybe it's getting that ball rolling and just really getting maybe some of that inertia around working this way.
I think the best way I can answer this is thinking back to my time at Vox, where I was brought on, we were building that CMS, and I was brought on because our product owner had more questions than she could answer. She needed somebody to help her. But before then, she was doing all her own research. Once I joined, I was doing all the research, and I was able to look at our sprints, our upcoming sprints when we were building our content management system. There were some things that there was no risk, or we already had enough based on support tickets or community feedback where we knew what to build. And so my proposal was, let's use these quieter research sprints to look further ahead and ask some big picture questions. Where can we take this product? What are the things that our competitors are doing that we need to think about? So at the time, the New York Times had done some really interesting visual storytelling. And so there were big picture projects around what is the future of visual storytelling and how does that impact what we're building in our content management system to support that. So it was a matter of saying, okay, this sprint, I'm going to sit out and I'm going to do, I guess, full or big picture or discovery research. And it was just picking the spots. And then that kind of builds trust. It shows that you're investing in research. Nobody's going to say this was a mistake, because even if we don't actually act on that research, we still understand we have some competitive research. We see some trends in what publishers are doing. But that was my way of shoehorning in discovery research and big picture research, was being practical and say, okay, there's nothing to do in the next 2 weeks that's really mission critical. Let's make this time to do big picture research.
I appreciate that. I come back to your book. Maybe an example in there is it talks a lot about getting your work out there, making it visible, getting it up on the wall, all that kind of stuff. Just so many actions I think that we can take of just showing that it even exists. that cause a bit of inertia, and like it causes that VP when they're walking by to look at the wall and ask a question of what is this all about? And then before you know it, it's a whole bunch of other things get unpacked. And I think there's huge value sometimes in just org change of visibility, as you talked about in the book.
Yeah. Going back when I was at MailChimp, we created personas, and our director of UX at the time, Aaron Walter, he decided we were going to put these personas everywhere. And not only that, we were going to spend a ton of money doing photo shoots and designing really beautiful posters. This was way back in the carefree days where we were printing money at the time and we thought it would never end. That's not always possible, but we had persona posters hanging up everywhere. And so that built awareness, and people had questions and they would come to us and ask. In these more, or I guess economical times, I should say, you have to be a little bit more savvy. Just sharing your work in Slack channels and saying, here's 5 things we learned about customers in this region, or here's 10 things you should know about people who do X. Very BuzzFeed style reports, but putting those in not just your team's Slack channel, but anywhere people will come across your findings. This way you're building awareness of research. You're making people realize, 1, we do research here. And 2, you're unlocking this ability to ask questions in other people. And so they start saying, wait, I want to know these things too. And that builds demand. People start asking for more research. That's another way to get people to open up the checkbook or budget for doing more research. Maybe it's hiring an agency, maybe it's bringing in a senior researcher, but it's a great way to create demand and make people realize there's no barriers between us and our users. Let's ask them our questions.
A question here from Susan. Orgs have tilted maybe from UX derived product managers to more technical, maybe even data led kind of product managers. So the researchers essentially need to ramp up on tech. Do they need to essentially get better at this?
I don't know if I have a point of view on this question. I do think it goes back to researchers being shapeshifters, and we also self-select for industries that we find interesting. So it might not be knowing tech, but if you're a researcher and you're looking at jobs and jobs in fintech resonate with you, you really do need to do your homework and understand how financial systems work and get up to speed on banking regulations and know your customer laws. Same as if you're working in healthcare and understanding patient privacy. So maybe it's not tech so much as subject matter expertise or domain expertise, so that as a researcher, you're asking the right questions while also being mindful of legislation and regulations you need to be adhering to. And also, you can be the person who, when your product person or engineer suggests something, you as a researcher have enough knowledge to say, we can't do that. That would violate X, Y, and Z, or actually, no, we shouldn't do that because of this regulation that we might possibly be overstepping. So I know I didn't answer the question, but we have to be subject matter expertise as researchers.
We got a little bit of time left for some more questions. One question anonymously submitted here is, what's the best way to do research when essentially users aren't aware of it and where we don't want to disturb them? That feels a little weird to me, that we wouldn't want to disturb them.
Yeah. How fitting that the question was submitted by anonymous, and it's about doing research when your subject doesn't know they're being researched. There are tools like Hotjar where you can see a playback of how somebody navigated a screen. There's always A/B testing where a user might not know they're within a test environment, but they're being served a new UI that only 2% of users are seeing. There's page pathing tools where we could see how people navigate from page to page within our product or our website. Those are the areas that come to mind to do research without necessarily disclosing that we are doing research. But what I've said to my current cohort of colleagues at Hearst is these tools are valuable. They're great, but they still don't tell you why somebody did the thing that they're doing. So yes, they might have gone from page X to page Y, You don't know why. For all you know, their cat jumped on their trackpad and accidentally clicked. You don't know their rationale for even coming to your app today. So what was their mindset? And you don't know, did they actually achieve the goal that they set out for? So those tools are useful to a point, but at some point you do have to actually engage with users in a way that they know of. And I would also reframe the scenario. It's not disruptive if it's informed consent. If you say, I'm a researcher, do I have your permission to just watch you as you use our app? And you could also set some parameters. I'm not going to be able to see any numbers you enter into a credit card field. I will not see any whatever information that you feel is out of bounds. We can make sure that I don't see that. But it's okay to ask people for permission to do research and make sure that they consent to it. And in that case, you're not disrupting and you're not violating their privacy, but you're still getting valuable insights. And you could say, if you don't mind me interrupting, you did X. Can you tell me why you did that? That's the gold right there.
Yeah, definitely. My experience has always been users love to be able to tell you. They've been waiting for this opportunity. And so they're super pumped when you reach out and engage with them. They feel like part of the journey and part of the process of building the software solution that's theirs. Maybe time for one last question. What anti-bias practices you try to bring into your research work and the work that you do?
Yeah, when I think of anti-bias, there's the basics. Don't ask leading questions, which in my role at Hearst, I'm not only doing research, but I'm coaching my product colleagues and my design team colleagues to ask better questions. So don't ask leading questions, don't ask biased questions, don't assume that somebody, just because they're using your product doesn't mean they like your product or they're extracting value from your product. Don't assume, don't lead, don't ask biased questions. There's probably another layer to that, which is about making sure that we are doing representative research. Is our research inclusive? Are we balancing for gender, diversity, location? So I don't know if that was the intent of the question, but when I think there's the bias at how we do research and also the bias at how we recruit for research. So we have to be mindful of, are we hearing from the breadth of our users? And if not, how do we make sure that we do that going forward? So ask the right questions and make sure you're asking a representative group of people, not just the people who were the first to agree to participate in research. I think that's how I'd answer that question.
Thank you, Greg. Really important conversation. Like I said, a lot of great content in this book. I encourage people to check out. With that, I'm going to wrap things up. We have shared a link inside our chat. Would love your feedback. We do share feedback both with other speakers. It also helps our team curate and build better events for you. And you do have a chance to win, if you want to leave your email, one of 8 copies of Greg's book that we'll give away as part of this. And I chose 8, by the way, because it's 2 times May the 4th. Happy Star Wars Day. I've even got my Stormtrooper helmet here already on the go. If you want to continue the conversation, create a post within our community. We'd love to have you ask these same questions, maybe questions we didn't get asked to today, things that you're curious about in your practice. We're here to help, and lots of people certainly can share their thoughts and ideas and contributions on that front. We've got lots of community events coming up. Next week, we've got our roundtable, and we also have Jess McMullen, one of my former colleagues at Enform User Experience, coming in to talk about building resilient products. And at the end of May, we've got our Supercharge Your Product Team product conference. Lots of exciting speakers. We have 12 people over 3 days talking, and some really great sessions about how teams are supercharging, working collaboratively, and executing faster in these challenging times. If you do want to speak or get involved in one of these sessions, we'd love to hear from you. You don't have to have a book. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be some thought-provoking, amazing person who has a huge, giant following and audience. We'd love to really hear from lots of different practitioners about how they're approaching the challenges and problems of building products that matter. So feel free to find that information on our website. You can search for Speak. So again, thank you, Greg, very much. Really appreciate it. And it was wonderful to talk with you today. And thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Scott.
No problem. Take care.